I will be talking about the game Cyberpunk 2077, and I'm going to do so by reflecting a little bit on Cyberpunk as a game, as a genre of literature, and just in general. But also, I'm going to touch on a couple of things in terms of material literature, material culture, literary perspectives on it, and the genre of immersive sims. So I would like to start first off with this quotation by William Gibson from his very influential novel Neuromancer. Night City was like a deranged experiment in social Darwinism designed by a bored researcher who kept one thumb permanently on the fast forward button. With this in mind, I would like to specify a little bit what is going to be my approach and how I'm going to be looking at literature in parallel to video games and a little bit reflecting on material culture and what that means in terms of literary representations, but also representations in games. So what I would do today is, as Hannah kindly mentioned, my first monograph came out just a couple of weeks ago in February of this year. And while I was focusing on urban crime control, it did so primarily in cinema. So as Hannah already mentioned, I'm a sociologist working in criminology. So I bring a particular social science perspective to the study of games. So what I'm doing today is something that we call symptomatic reading. This is very much in the tradition of Louis Althusser, Frederick Jameson, and broadly speaking, Marxist literary studies. And I'm going to be highlighting 4 symptoms. As you can tell from the title of my talk, those would be corporate colonialism, cyberpunk, material culture, and the immersive sim. So what is symptomatic reading and what does it mean to refer to symptoms that certain texts possess, and what does it mean to read them? Well, I'm referring here to what Frederick Jameson refers to as the political unconscious of a given text. So that is the collection of symptoms, either latent or manifest, in a given text, however broadly we might construe it, and their significance for reading with a particular intention behind it. Some of you might already be familiar with Louis Althusser's approach, which looks at how Marx reads other thinkers and how we can then subsequently read Marx's Capital symptomatically and understand things that remain unspoken and things that perhaps illustrate things that Marx did not necessarily mean or would like to clarify further. But for the sake of what I'm looking at today, I would also like to draw on what Barbara Foley refers to as the political unconscious of a text testifies to the ways in which both the form and the explicit propositions embodied in it function strategically to contain. That is, to encompass and to control social contradictions that defy reconciliation in the world beyond the text. So in a certain sense, what I'm looking at is games, but also texts, and also broadly the culture that underpins cyberpunk. That is both material and ideological. As you can tell by drawing on the work of Louis Althusser, ideology is always present. So what do I mean by these 4 symptoms? I'm not really going to be providing definitive answers. Partly, this is not really a cop-out, but it's really a reading based on the genre of cyberpunk. Frankly, I do not believe that the cyberpunk genre, or even Cyberpunk 2077, provides definitive answers to the problems that it engages with. I think there's a closed space there, and I'm going to clarify a little bit what that means. But before that, I'd like to start a little bit with some historical context. So corporate colonialism. For those of you who have played the game already, Cyberpunk 2077, that is, you probably would have heard Johnny Silverhand. I'm going to clarify a little bit who that is, for those of you who are not aware, but a major character who has a history of terrorist activity, is anti-corporation, broadly anti-capitalist, though the game does not really specify that, refers to something as a problem in cyberpunk society, in particular in the space of Night City, as corporate colonialism. It's very loosely defined, but broadly it is referring to corporate exploitation, resource degradation of society, and broadly anything that you might think of when you hear cyberpunk, whatever it might be in terms of medium, whether texts or William Gibson's ones in particular, or games, or any other kind of corporate dystopian fiction. But my point here is a quite simple one. I'm not really going to dwell too much on it, but really that is the history of the term. I'm not really going to go into critique of the term and what that means, but I would just like to clarify that there's multiple examples in our real life history, not fictional at all, that represent what corporate colonialism might entail. So Fordlandia, for those of you that might have heard about this, is in essence a corporate colony in Brazil organized by Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. As you can imagine in Greg Grandin's book here, the comparison is quite clear. It's pretty much something that is taken out of Heart of Darkness. It is referred to as a jungle city. It is a corporate colonial town spread all over the world by colonial powers. And there's parallels between Detroit's Rouge River, where the Ford Motor Company really lifted off, with the Thames, with Conrad's Tale in the Heart of Darkness, and pretty much the context of Brazil being substituted for the larger context of Africa and broadly the colonized world. So for the Ford Motor Company, there was something referred to as the Ford way of doing things, what Grandin would refer to as corporate colonialism. That meant tight social control, a racial division of labor, relying on a white racial aristocracy and racialized minorities used for particular types of labor that is highly exploitative. Obviously, the global connotation here between the imperial core and the periphery, or what we might refer to in other terms as the global north and the global south, is clear. As I said, I'm not really going to dwell on this, but there's just a couple of examples I wanted to introduce. Another one is drawing on the book by James Martin called Banana Cowboys, which refers to the United Fruit Company and its operation in Central America. For those of you that are not aware, the United Fruit Company, very much along the lines of what Ford Motor Company did, it would organize colonial towns that were quite complicated, relying on racialized divisions of labor, highly exploitative, and in a certain sense also contributed to a corporate welfareism culture that also discriminated massively. So as you can see with some of the quotes that I've selected here, a big part similar to the Ford way of doing things was creating a regime of public hygiene, for example, under skilled direction. That was obviously a racialized connotation there, and constant supervision, social control, that is to say, that could effectively render tropical regions as healthy as the northern latitudes. There was a lot of prejudice and assumption there that obviously you can see from the text. There was also medical connotations that are quite relevant for the cyberpunk genre too. There's examinations, sample collections, inspections, and experiments that would discriminate quite heavily and would privilege, of course, the colonizer population. There was also a concerted effort to shape the attitudes and perceptions of its expatriates, in part by enlisting them in the protection of a spectacle of American modernity to workers and neighboring populations. Ford was quite well known for doing this too, so much so that, being a sociologist, I would like to refer to, in the early 1900s, it had an entire department called the Sociology Division, whose goal was to enter the domestic environment of workers and police social control and find out more in order to ensure this skilled direction and constant supervision. There are multiple other ways in which colonization of this particular corporate kind worked. Martin particularly points to an entire case study of how amateur scientists contributed to this. So it was not only about social welfare, it was not only about medical expertise, but also archaeology, also different types of cultural endeavors that still would create this disparity and lack of equivalence, disproportionality in between the global north and the global south, the colonizer and the colonized. And without really, again, as I say, keep dwelling on this term corporate colonialism that I would broadly refer to as imperialism, or very much aligned with perspectives on settler colonialism, I'd like to finally draw on a term by Comac, in which she specifies that corporate colonialism retained the focus on colonial relations while drawing attention to the economic motives tied to the relationship between colonizers and colonized. It incorporates the key element of settler colonialism, that is the appropriation of land, and its main purpose, capital accumulation. As such, it is pretty much rooted very firmly in what Marx would refer to as primary or primitive accumulation, and as such, it is the roots out of which capitalism can spring. Indeed, colonialism, as it unfolded in Canada, was not simply a matter of settlement, but of extracting resources tied to capitalist development and expansion. And Comac, in this particular Canadian context, refers to the Hudson's Bay Company, which, by the way, still exists, a colonial power and company that has shaped a huge part of the settler colonialism and corporate colonialism implications for Indigenous people. Obviously, there's multiple examples and instances here that I'm not mentioning. Perhaps you would be familiar with the East India Trading Company, the Royal Niger Company. It was, to put simply, quite clearly, a common tactic. And corporate colonialism was one of the ways in which this distribution of power, social control, and colonial project was maintained and expanded even further. So putting this aside and kind of moving a little bit towards the topic at hand here, cyberpunk, what is it and what really makes it sci-fi? What really makes it relevant for us in terms of understanding what is colonialism that Johnny Silverhand is riling up the main character against and wants us to fight for, and quite often complains about it. So when we talk about material culture of sci-fi, there's a lot of facile examples we can make. It's usually something similar, something based in our reality, but a little bit different, obviously with Keanu Reeves. But in the case of Cyberpunk 2077, there's a plethora of instances where we see the material culture coming to life. There's fashion, there's weapons, there's material culture such as furniture, architecture, spaces themselves. There's derelict spaces, there's underdeveloped spaces, hyper-developed factory industrial spaces. So it is a very rich milieu that allows us to engage with what is it about the material conditions that shape that particular society. So one way is we can think about weapons. Some might be named with particular names. For those of you who have played the game, you will know Guts, Death, and Taxes. This is kind of a ranking of famous weapons. You might have Mantis blades. A lot of those as well can be branded. So they might be branded after a particular corporation, such as Militech or Arasaka, the two main ones. But also the bodily modifications. So in multiplayer, we already have people who have engaged with this, such as Steph Farnsworth, who has referred to from a mutant perspective on the body. But the perspective that I'm interested in here is the material/immaterial aspects of the body. The body as a commodity, the body as something that can be supplanted through commodities. So what you see here is the bodily modifications of what we might call cyborgization, quite common and quite widespread in modding communities that, as you can see, are also branded. The one to your left, in particular, Arasaka, is particularly important. I'd like to draw your attention to it because it is the main corporation that the Avatar and Johnny Silverhand, partner to the Avatar, fights against throughout the entire game's narrative. But in order to make sense of this, and in order to qualify what is this material culture of cyberpunk, I'd like to take a step back and to look at this symptomatic reading. What is the text that games like Cyberpunk 2077 or literary texts like William Gibson's Neuromancers draw on without really clarifying or being explicit about it? So to do this, I go back to the work of Frederick Jameson again. In his book on Raymond Chandler, subtitled The Detections of Totality, he makes a very big claim early on, and he says that the atmosphere of a given period is crystallized, first of all, in its objects. Obviously, as some of you might be aware, that what he is referring to here is the detective story, quite clearly popularized by Raymond Chandler and the detective character of Philip Marlowe. But what he is referring to is the particular time period and how the genre captures particular things about its materiality, its culture. And what does that really say for us as symptomatic readers? So he points to the double-breasted suits, the long dresses of the new look, the fluffy hairdos, and the styling of the automobiles. So he argues that this crystallization, this nostalgia for a particular time, and we tend to be quite fascinated with this, aims at a world like our own in its general conditions. Industrialism, market capitalism, mass production, and unlike it only in being somewhat simpler. So a nostalgia that tends to simplify the past. So this will be quite relevant for making sense of cyberpunk in the moment. But also an important context for Jameson in which the detective story of this kind came to prominence was the beginning of the Cold War. People like John Bellamy Foster and Mark Chesney have highlighted the expansion of the military-industrial complex and the mixture of advertising agencies and corporations and military manufacture, what Jameson refers to as the prodigious expansion in advertising, the use of television as a more vivid and suggestive way of selling competing and similar products. We can think about, he mentions here the radio, but we can think about the multiple ways in which this even expands further once we introduce cybernetics and cyber technology and computing. So Jameson continues. He says that these older products had a certain stability about them. That is why we are nostalgic. They're simpler. There's a certain permanence of identity that we can immediately identify. And in the detective story, for readers who are aware, you would recognize that the brand name is very much synonymous with the object itself. It's the case that a car is a Ford, a lighter is a Ronson, or a hat is a Stetson. You don't need to refer to pick up someone's hat. You pick up your Stetson. It's the brand that does the heavy lifting. It's the commodity that exemplifies and captures, encapsulates all of the meaning of the object itself. So these older kinds of products remain relatively integrated into the landscape of natural objects, Jameson says. But lying midway between nature and human reality, they correspond to a world in which the principal activity is still the overcoming of the resistance of nature and of things, and in which human need and desire arise as a function of that struggle. Quite simply, there are not that many brands of hats at this point in time. There is a hat, and that is encapsulated by that specific brand that popularized it. But with the development of technology, TV and radio that Jameson highlights after World War II, and cybernetics and computing a little bit later, we see that advertising expands this even further. So advertising is not so much about the creation of an object, a new type of physical thing, Jameson argues, but rather an artificial need or desire, a kind of mental or ideological symbol by which the consumer's craving to buy is associated with a particular type of packaging and label. So he says that the life problems of such a world are radically different in kind from those of the relatively simple world of needs and physical resistance that preceded it. They involve a struggle, not against things and relatively solid systems of power that you can clearly identify, but against ideological phantasms, bits and pieces of matter that is not entirely material, so to speak. So there's also this idea that the initial desire is not really the solution of a material problem. It's not, we can say quite simply, a use value concern, but the style and symbolic connotations of the product to be possessed. So I've talked a little bit too much about theory so far, so I'd like to take a moment and reflect. Consumerism, this advertising aspect, is spread throughout the world of cyberpunk, 2077 in particular, but cyberpunk genre in general. Brands, names that are not familiar, whatever it might be, material culture dominates. It's whether it's derelict, whether it's graffitied, whether it's nice and shiny, whether it's of a particular class background, regardless. So with this in mind, I was tempted to draw on Morissette's idea, article on I'd like to buy the world a Nuka-Cola and the ubiquity of soda machines in video games. So what we can highlight here is that, in essence, the ubiquity of soda machines, or vending machines, as we might call them, mirror players' internalized values concerning notions like free markets, competition, and consumerist ideas of personal fulfillment. Drawing on Dyer, Whitford, and Deputer, we can say, welcome to your second life, much like the first. And obviously, for those aware with the work of Mark Fisher, capitalist realism, and the idea that a world without capitalism is difficult to imagine, as Morissette says, that's a stretch, is pretty much central to the idea of cyberpunk. Which leads us to, what is cyberpunk? What is the genre, and how can we make sense of it? So we continue with this particular example of a vending machine in the context of the game, quite clearly referred to as a spontaneous craving satisfaction machine. As Jameson says, at this point, rather than invoking alienated labor, as Dyer, Whitford, and Deputer would say, we might rather speak of alienated leisure. We are concerned here with not so much the game as preparing the player for the marketplace, the job, or the repetitiveness of labor, but really, how do we make sense of alienated leisure, of being exposed to we can say capitalist utopia in a sense, but also a capitalist dystopia quite clearly for many people. That is to say, quite simply, a capitalism unleashed. So this gets us to, how does Jameson make sense of it? I'm providing you with a lot of quotes here, but I'm not really engaging with everything. It's just more of a frame of reference. But really what Jameson refers to as what is at the core of cyberpunk is really the new conservative revolution of the 1980s, Thatcher and Reagan's influences, but also globalization. In very specific sense, it was also more or less the punk aspect becoming quite prominent, the pulp aspect, the greediness of reality, the sensorial overload of this new future that is supposedly awaiting us. For Jameson as well, we can continue to say that this is quite clearly dystopian in nature, regardless of how utopian this unleashed capitalism might look, because it would imply a certain kind of production, whether through robotized or mechanized labor. But a lot of these utopian representations depend on what he calls the utopia of full employment, and even of non-alienated labor. So it's not so much that labor is the core of the cyberpunk genre, but it's grifting, it's hustling. It's motivated by an idealism also unwilling to trust a sinful human race with the poisoned gift of free time. That is to say, as any reader familiar with the texts by William Gibson, that it's decadence, it's punk, it's addiction, it's not being able to manage. A lot of it is the smell of urine, a lot of it is about modified perception, the body falling apart. In many ways, representation of the punk reaction to the 1980s and the political and economic changes. So without really going into too much depth, I feel obligated to note that for Gibson and cyberpunk in general, the global is a huge aspect. There's a merging of the world. Japan is a very big thing in the case of Cyberpunk 2077. Night City, the main place in which everything happens, is dominated by a Japanese corporation, Arasaka. So there's a combination here of first world science and technology with a properly third world population explosion. Obviously, reactionary fears about overpopulation here remain at the genre and in a lot of sci-fi, regardless how progressive it might be. And places like Europe, for example, are portrayed as a kind of elegant museum or tourist playground, which is also an evolutionary and economic dead end. For example, in Neuromancer, Amsterdam is mentioned as just a half-remembered trip for shopping. It's also important to say and qualify that a lot of the representations of the cityscape and Night City, but also cyberpunk in general, is reliant on Orientalism. It's a substitution of the asphalt jungle of LA, of the sprawl, by the postmodern collage of urban landscape taken from places like Shinjuku and Kowloon City in Tokyo and Hong Kong. But to draw the parallel even further and to make the comparison even deeper between what Jameson writes about Raymond Chandler and what I'm trying to say here about William Gibson's Neuromancer in Cyberpunk 2077 is the naming. The brand name is still all-powerful and ever-present. We see it everywhere in Neuromancer where there's an excess of hyped-up name dropping. And there's also what Jameson calls a Hunter-Thompsonian global tourism, where it's a schizophrenic moving from place to place, schizophrenic in the sense of Deleuze and Guattari, but also here the quote from Pattern Recognition captures it. A fresh fruit t-shirt, her black Buzz Rickson's MA1, anonymous black skirt from a Tulsa thrift, etc., etc. The names are mentioned, not clarified. The reader might know them, they might not. It's partly reliant on the idea of the reader not clearly knowing, do these things exist? Do these things, are they the same thing that the reader would assume? As Jameson says, eBay is the right word for a current collective unconscious. But also there's an element here that these brand names are what Savio Delaney has referred to as the tool of specialism and expertise in sci-fi, conveying knowledge, conveying the capacity to name, but also working at this tension of both instant obsolescence and the global provenance, things yet not quite being named. We can draw a spatial parallel here as well and refer to BAMA, the Boston-Atlanta metropolitan area. For those familiar with North American geography, it's quite interesting because we can see that the space itself becomes a name. It doesn't really matter the distance, seemingly, but Boston and Atlanta have a huge distance in between them, and it becomes ridiculous to treat that as a conurbation, right? That's the general idea, the sprawl. So we can also say that, as I said, there is also an anxiety about naming things. Each of these items that are being named, these brands, are on their way to the ultimate destination of a name of its own. What Jameson refers to in the case of Chandler, that the author's task is to make an inventory of these objects, to demonstrate by a fullness of catalog how completely he knows his way around the world of machines. And this is quite interesting in the outliers of this. Remember, this is a symptomatic reading. I'm interested in what is not always mentioned. So the thing that I'm pointing to here is the aspect of the shuriken. If anyone's read Neuromancer, there's an element in which the main character, Case, is stopped dead in his tracks by looking at a shuriken, a star, a Japanese weapon, and he's fascinated by him. And it's the one thing that remains prominent throughout the narrative that is not branded, that is present, that Case constantly touches as a reminder of his material reality. And as he refers to the shuriken, the centers stamped with dragons or yin-yang symbols, again, the Orientalist aspect here, caught the street's neon and twisted it. And it came to Case, the main character, that these were the stars under which he voyaged, his destiny spelled out in the constellation of Cheap Crow. Quite clearly that the character is aware that the impoverished material reality that shapes who he is. And it's all of this summarized in broader literature and postmodernism that I don't like to dwell too much, but we can say that cyberspace becomes a different representational version of what cannot be represented, and yet is more concrete, this tension between brand name, commodity, and thing. So it's not so much a dystopia, one narrative among others, but it is about the fundamental laws of the market, of things becoming immaterial and disembodied, what Jameson and other places refers to an orgy of language and representation, an excess of representational consumption. So this leads us to the genre as a way of wrapping up. So what is the immersive sim? Cyberpunk 2077 partially fits into this, partially not. Usually the term immersive sim is something that is referred to in the context of games by Arcane Studios, such as Dishonored, more recently Deathloop, and some people have referred to it as the genre buster, in particular Hans-Joachim Backe, the genre that blends a mixture of multiple other genres, most prominently a first-person shooter and RPG. And in particular, there's a reliance on the subjectivity of the avatar and the player. The idea here that the first-person shooter was necessary for this game, as the developers specified, because it would allow for different experiences, quite common in the literary context, of addiction, distorted perception, etc. But also, other people such as Mark Bonner have highlighted that the architecture in computer games establish a narrow relationship under the aspect of an architectural mode of perception within an environment built for specific use. And immersive sims and open spaces such as Night City provide this exact negation of it, this freedom of movement, interaction, and that spaces can change and become different things depending on how the player reacts to them. So as a final thing, I wanted to point to how Gibson refers to the space itself. He refers to the main character as a console cowboy, obviously a nostalgic image, but also it is evoking a fantasy of limitless open spaces, a frontier without end, a colonial frontier, quite clearly, in the case of the cowboys, a settler colonial one. So when Case is healed of the damage done, the bodily damage is a big aspect of both stories here, he experiences the following. He experiences a fluid neon origami trick, the unfolding of his distanceless home, his country, transparent 3D chessboard extending to infinity. That spacelessness, that the immateriality is the way out of the disease of the body, the material restrictions. And in both cases, both main protagonists suffer from an impending doom clock where they're going to die at a particular point in time. They don't know yet unless they fulfill that final task. So as a way of summary and a way of clarifying what are the main things that I wanted to say, being conscious of time here, is that Cyberpunk, both as evidenced in William Gibson's Neuromancer and in Cyberpunk 2077, captures something about the body as a site of struggle, as reflective of wider society. It is the site of disease, of addiction. In the case of the game, disease is something that puts the character on a particular quest and investigation in order to figure out how to solve this and how to live with their life. But also a key part of this, and that converges with the immersive sim aspect, is the self. What Jameson in the detective story refers to as an organ of perception, a membrane which irritated serves to indicate in its sensitivity the nature of the world around it. So the character should capture something around it. I've already said enough about materiality and immateriality, but I wanted to make a note on the punk aspect here. The interesting thing to me about the game is, what is punk about it? Is it aesthetic? Is it the avatar? Is it nostalgia? Where there's really very little left from kind of the sensorial reality of the novel besides just the visual things. There's obviously a number of things that I can expand on in further detail, such as the material conditions in 1980s. And I would claim that Cyberpunk 2077 ends up being a kind of displaced, spaceless representation itself, because it tries to capture a fictionalized representation of 1980s capitalism as well. And finally, I wanted to use this example by Jameson, that this is what the main character, the protagonist, and the avatar experiences, a dilemma, equally intolerable alternatives that the protagonist finds oneself poised in, the loss of their present identity or the permanent eclipse of the old one. The idea that this formulation allows us to glimpse again the fundamental anxiety of utopian representations, namely the fear of losing that familiar world in which all our vices and virtues are rooted, in exchange for a world in which all these things and experiences, positive as well as negative, will have been obliterated. Thank you.